Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Indie Diarist podcast, a show on the human stories behind indie game development. This is your loyal Indie Diarist and host, Anthony L. Wolf, writer, narrative designer, and senior content manager in social media, and this is the fourth Footnote episode of the show, which means it's a bonus one, rotating around a specific topic rather than a developer. And for this one, I decided to sit down with Tony Wijs, the owner and I believe also founder of Immersed Productions, a production studio specialized in sound design, voice acting, and a lot of great things that indie game developers can tap into. But before we go into the episode and dive into the power of detail in sound design, a couple of things for me. First, a big shout out to my Patreons, which are, at the time of recording this, Feinoko, Zagini, Angelissa, Fishbump Dev, and Peleg. You guys are amazing, and I love that you support the show this way every single month. Thank you so much. If you too want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/theindiediarist or on theindiediarist.com to find all the relevant links, including links to Discord and social media. But without further ado, let's dive straight into this episode to discuss the power of detail in sound design. Alright, hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of the Indie Diarist podcast, a show in the human stories behind indie game development. Speaking to you today, as usual, is your loyal Indie Diarist and host, Anthony L. Wolf. And today with me is actually a very special guest from Immersed Productions, which is a production studio. And you've seen the title of this episode already. We're here to talk about the power of detail in sound design. But first, I want to hand it over to you, Tony. Just say a few things about yourself, who you are,
Sure.
where you're based, and why we're here today.
Yeah, my name is Tony. Last name Tony, or my name is Tony Wijs. I'm the founder of Immersed Productions. I'm also a voice actor. I've been doing sound, probably 15 years now, give or take, for quite a while. I've worked on video games and animes and cartoons. It's a great field to be in, and sound is one of the most important storytelling pieces to really anything, in my opinion. So, excited to be here. Thanks.
Oh, well, my pleasure, actually. And it was fun when you reached out and we just came together and we were like, okay, so what can we talk about?
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things that we kept bringing up was how sound design and the power of detail in sound design can help in game design as well. So we will dive through this topic and dive into this topic and just explore it with a bit more depth as we go on. But first of all, I guess one thing that came up when we were talking the first time was our shared passion for stories and storytelling. Of course, me being a writer and you just enjoying telling stories through sound. So that is one thing that I felt like was worth mentioning from the start, and that we can then carry into the conversation. Also, one thing that I will say from the start is I'm no sound designer. That's why Tony is here. So I may say some stupid things, and if I do, Tony, please correct me. But I'm no more than a sound design enthusiast. So this is all about us just coming together and discussing the beauty of sound design with an expert like Tony. So I want to talk about, to get started, about one of the things, actually the very first thing that you brought up when we came together for the first time, which is the fact that sound design is really an overlooked art, isn't it? Yeah. Now, I ran a little poll over the last 24 hours on my Twitter channel, asking people if sound design was a priority for them. And actually, 60% said that it is a priority, but a good chunk also said that it's a nice to have, or that it's not a priority at all. So what are your thoughts on that, Tony? How can we start framing this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is the same thing in games and in film and things like that people go into. Sound really is such a big part of, it's almost like the second half of like an experience. Like without sound, because we can't, you think about a video game that you're playing, right? You have the interaction, you have the visuals, and then you have what feedback do you have that something's going on, right? So you can't taste it, you can't smell it. So your sound is the only other option besides the visuals and the gameplay itself. So I feel like sound is so important, and sound creates an emotional response that other things just don't grab onto. Like when people think about their favorite scene from a video game, without the music, without the sound design and everything else to encompass it, it doesn't hit the same. And it really, it's really important to have and to do well, and to really, it's just as important as telling that story. The sound is pivotal, in my opinion. It's a very important, critical part of any medium, in my opinion, especially games.
I totally agree with you, and it's something that came up during the poll that I ran over the past 24 hours, and I'm going to bring it up right now as we talk, because there were some answers that were saying exactly the same thing, like the fact that sound, the way people react to sound is so interesting and so different compared to many other parts of game design in general. So I will find the little poll while we speak, but I think this is a great way to introduce the topic, and also the fact that sound design isn't just sound effects, isn't just the kind of sounds that you put into the game. It's about mixing, it's about voice acting, and you yourself mentioned the voice acting is a bit overlooked in game development, especially in indies, of course, because you should hire an actor and just have them do that. So yeah, like what is your experience doing all of that stuff?
I think you know, I mean, growing up playing a lot of games before the voice acting world happened, you know, it was interesting because in our heads, when we read the subtitles to a game, I feel like we always play a character in our head if we're reading it, you know, as if somebody was speaking it. And I feel like when you have an actor or somebody who is breathing life into the voice of a character in a game, again, adds to that, just as important as your sound design in the game itself. Adds to that storytelling, adds to that emotional response. The reason people become so drawn to a game or characters or specific scenes in a game, things like that, are because of that sound, because of the way they said something, because of that emotional response that they had. I feel like that's such a big grip. It's almost like a language that everybody speaks. Right? Like sound is a language that everybody can speak and understand. And that if you can do it well, especially in your game, it's going to evoke a very specific response, especially what you're trying to achieve, and grab them and pull them into that experience and be like, whoa, that's memorable to me, and feels really special.
And I found the poll, by the way.
Awesome.
So I want to just mention, reference a few things that people said in the replies, which I think were very powerful. So Hilltop Games said, we think that especially with indie games, which are so often greater than the sum of their parts, sound design and music can be a huge boost for immersion and polish, and compensate for other things that may be rougher around the edges. Yeah. Which I think is a beautiful take on trying to enhance that immersion factor by using sound design and sounds.
Absolutely.
And just bringing the player in. And another beautiful thing that I read in the replies is by Dmitry Matviev. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. I probably am. Matviev is probably the right way to say it. But they say, one of the most important aspects to consider, in my opinion, we see the world by touch, smell, and sound, and only then our brain just scrambles a visual picture it thinks is close enough and calls it a day. You succeed when you make possible for a blind person to navigate the game world. Which is
that's beautiful.
Such a beautiful take on why sound design is so important.
I love that.
So with that in mind, I think it's clear by now that sound design has an important role in creating memorable experiences, and the fact that basically it embraces or just involves pretty much another one of the important senses that are crucial to create a game experience. So you're aiming for synesthesia there. You're aiming to try and have visuals and sound, and maybe even give you a sense of those textures when you're, and especially with new controllers, they're able to do that haptic feedback. That is, that is incredibly powerful. So we're aiming towards more immersion as an industry, and sound design plays a very important role there. But not just sound design is in itself, it's the power of detail in sound design. And this is where we get into the heart of the topic, which is how can, in your experience and by the things that you've seen, and looking at the things that you've done in the past, how and why do small sound details transform a game's narrative and atmosphere? And feel free to bring some examples that you like to the table. Could be something that you worked on,
Sure.
or it could be some games that that you've played that you love so much.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Details are so important, and it's interesting because it's easy enough to think like, oh, there could be a soundtrack and then the sounds and whatever that could be good enough. But it's like when you're exploring, when you're in a game and you're looking around, and you're exploring. I don't know if you guys grew up on the old Nintendo systems and things like that, but knowing when you get curious and you go over here to look at something and you're like, oh, what's that? And like I say, you're going to a waterfall, and that waterfall gets louder as you get closer to it. And that waterfall, you start to hear all the texture to that waterfall, and you're like, whoa, that's cool. And then you walk over here and you hear the wind start to pick up and things like that. Like, I think that's so cool because it almost mimics a real experience. I think the big thing is it transports you from you being a player of the video game to you are in the video game, right? You're immersed in that video game. You're suspending your reality. And part of that suspending reality is having a really, really evocative and interesting sound design in a game. And it can be realistic. It can be accurate. It can be hyper realistic, meaning that just a little bit larger than life in some ways, depending on the game. But even like detail in things like you talk about Counter-Strike, Counter-Strike or a game called Hunt that I played. It's an indie game.
I know Hunt.
Oh my gosh, Hunt is so good. The sound design is insane. And you walk up next to like the chickens and they're all like doing their thing and they can alert other people, and it just everything has a sound to it, and it's amazing. And it's like, whoa, this is like a living, breathing world. The gunshots, the footsteps, because without those things, not only would be a tactical disadvantage, but it would also feel a little empty, and there's things that I feel like with good sound design, and if it's done well, and it's really even the smallest of details, the smallest of things, the creaking of the wood, the winds, really enhance that experience so much. And sometimes without it, you start to wonder like, what's missing? And you don't always know what's missing. You can't think like, I don't know, something's missing here. Something's kind of falling flat, and I'm not sure what it is. And somebody wouldn't be able to pinpoint what it is. But it's probably something to do with sound.
Talking about Counter-Strike, I don't remember if the original was like that as well, because I played it quite a bit, but like always sparingly. Having just tried the Counter-Strike 2, I now in hindsight or retrospective, I'm kind of realizing that the footsteps nearby and the gunshots are almost at the same volume, and I feel like that is intentional, of course, because you want to hear the footsteps as much as the gunshots. And I was there maybe sitting in an empty room just with my AWP and listening to any footsteps approaching from nearby. And it made the experiences so much more immersive and so much more tactical.
Yes.
Because I could just move slower or just take my time and just tactically wait in specific spots to see if an enemy would pop up rather than just rushing around the corner. So I think that is super powerful. But while you were talking, I also got another example that I'm sure you will know, where actually it's not about the quantity of sound design that is in that game, but about the quality. If anything, there is less than there would be in other games. That is Shadow of the Colossus. The fact that Shadow of the Colossus, between the lack of music unless you are in very specific spots, such as fighting a Colossus, or the fact that you're constantly immersed in nature and total silence, in that wilderness, in that stillness, sound design plays such an important role there, and the sound of aggro just galloping and all of that. It's and of course, Shadow of the Colossus works by subtraction, because there are a lot of things there in that game's design that work by subtraction. The fact that you have less to work with,
Yeah.
And it works because of that. Same for Eco or Ico. I don't know how you say it in English because I'm not native, of course, as people will know. But same for that game too, because most of the game is actually you walking around and you hear the footsteps of yourself and the companion Yorda, I think. They're just beautiful games. And with The Last Guardian, they tried to do something like that, and I think it works too because it's just you and Trico. So it's not always about how much sound you put into a game. It's the quality of it, and if you are deliberate about it, and how you design it, and how you mix it, and all of that. And I'm sure you will agree there.
Yes. And the experience is again, it's gotta, like, when you're mixing something for a game and you're playing it, and all of a sudden you just feel this, like, you're like, whoa, hold on a minute. 20 minutes just went past. I feel like I was so immersed in what I was just doing. I felt an emotional response to something that was happening. You know, you're doing it right. You know, when you're kind of just in there and it's like, yeah, that's good enough. You know, that sounds like it would, I guess, be there. But there's always a purpose for the things that are there. You know, if you're doing a minimalist type of thing where there's not a lot of music unless something's happening. And I look at games like Hitman for that. IO Interactive, I love their Hitman games. There's not a lot of the music or anything like that, but the ambience around you, people talking, the sound of, you know, waves and wind, or the you know, whatever is going on. And then it's when you start to get into like a situation where things get a little bit dicey, all of a sudden the music starts to kick in, and that adds that hype. Whoa. And then you do something, it adds this, like, this symbol, and it's like, oh gosh, something happened. I made a mistake. Oh no. Somebody caught me. And I love that because it's grabbing you by an emotional response. And I do think that out of all genres, horror games probably do it a lot better in a lot of ways, because they really want you to feel those senses. And I know in some cases that I don't know if all games do this, but infrasound, which I don't know if you've ever heard of infrasound. Infrasound is basically like really low frequency energy or audio.
Oh, yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
And it creates a specific feeling. So like there's
the
like
kind of sound that dogs can hear, if I remember right. Yeah,
dogs can hear, or then there's really low frequencies.
Bats, I think
bats can hear. But there's really low vibration stuff that's like 19 hertz. They call it, or something like a ghost note. Maybe it was 17 hertz. I can't remember. I have to remember at the top of my head. But a ghost note, if you look it up on YouTube, it causes a sense of anxiety by listening to it. You really don't really hear it that much. It's more of a feeling, but that energy creates a sense of almost not panic, but a sense of uneasiness. You combine that with the sound of a game, especially a horror game or something like that. All of a sudden now you have that intensity start to, like, okay, this is feeling really uneasy right now. Something's about to happen, I feel like, you know? And I think that's really cool. And maybe they don't know it's there. And that's okay. Because I think the best sound design is invisible. You're just there, and you're doing it, and you're warped into that world. You're not thinking like, oh, that's a cool sound that it has made over there. I mean, sure, you can appreciate it if you're looking for it, but in a typical experience, you're just so immersed in that world that you don't have time to think about that.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up horror games, because they're my favorite example as well, and that's what we were discussing at the beginning when we came together the first time. Every time I play, especially the first person horror games, but just any kind of horror game, especially lately, like there were Visage and others, there were the Mortuary Assistant. But even just Resident Evil 8 Village, the part in the villa, in Villa Beneviento, that part, that segment of the game, it's so immersive. And the fact that you just walk around there, which is actually, I think, a reference to all those beautiful indie horror games that came out over the past few years, which are so immersive in first person and such. So I think they did draw a lot of inspiration from those, but they did it extremely well, immersing you in that darkness, just you with your footsteps and maybe creaking sounds laughs and baby cries and all of that. And it's incredibly good. And I agree with you. Horror games do it. They're among the games that do it best because the sound is just so. The sound element is just so important to the immersion in a horror game. You just can't do it without it. It has to be. I mean, imagine a horror game without not even just music, without the creaking sounds and all the eeriness and all of that. And the voices and the echoes.
It would fall flat.
It would fall flat entirely. It wouldn't feel the same. It wouldn't contribute to the tension. But as someone was saying in the replies, indie games are greater than the sum of their parts. And so sound design, as you say, the best sound design is the one you don't even notice. It's the one that adds to the experience without pulling you out of it. And that lets you appreciate things inside 100%. The game in a way that works. But now I'm curious about how you create detail in sound design. If you want, you can share some behind the scenes from previous projects and such, how you work with indie developers and how you help them create that level of detail in sound design. How can developers aim for more detail? What should they think about? And those kinds of things.
So I think some of the biggest questions, and this is something that even as an actor I do, I always ask myself, where is this taking place? Where, like, what is around me? What time of day is it? Excuse me. What kind of elements are there? Even the most smallest, minute things that are there that you might not think like would be relevant still make sound. And still can be there, especially if they're spatial. Like think spatial sound. I always like to do things in my design that feels wide and open. So like when you're in a world, everything seems like if something's further away, it sounds further away. And you're like, oh, there's a little crying sound happening from far away over there. It makes me of like Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead 2. Oh, I love that game. The dang witch, I think is what she was called. Terrifying. Terrifying. But just like little details like that. Accuracy, I think, is awesome. Especially if you're doing something that's in the genre, like, like especially tactical things like that. But even because realistic stuff, like I'm talking like realistic doesn't make a lot of sound. You know what I'm saying? Like when you see a gun, you don't hear all the intricate parts of the gun. That's stuff that we add. We want to hear. Our brain says, why isn't it making those noises? But it doesn't actually do that. So I think like what enhances those sounds that makes you go, yeah, that feels good. That feels strong. Gives you a sense of power. It gives you a sense of feeling like you're in control. All these sounds that you're hearing, it enhances that mood that's happening. So I always look at that. I always look at anything that I'm designing, anything that can be added. And again, it's not about adding too much or like, oh, I need to add more of this or more of this. It's not about that. It's more about making sure that what you do add is really hitting the mark.
Yeah. Remember, especially remember that you're not making unless you're doing a simulator, but you're not making a one-to-one copy of reality. Right. You're creating something. You're creating an experience. So you don't necessarily want to capture all the sounds that you would hear in reality. You just want to capture the right ones that make sense for what you're doing.
Yes.
I also feel like until now we've talked a lot about realistic and hyper-realistic sounds. How can indie devs actually, or solo devs, or just game developers in general, approach games where realistic sound isn't necessarily needed? Imagine like a 3D platformer like Mario. So the sounds there are obviously different. Of course, you would have grass and such, but
yeah, something like Mario is a really good example, actually. And it's interesting because when I think of games, like especially in the Mario genre, and this is more of a synesthesia kind of feeling that I get. I always feel that their sounds are rounded, like very softened, and they don't feel like hard or impactful or cinematic or booming, and that's fine because it doesn't make sense for the genre that it is. But it feels charming. It has a very charming sense to it. It feels like it doesn't sound clunky or out of place. It just feels fluid and and smooth. I feel like Mario's sound, like games like that, are really smooth. And so if it's something that like, or like something like Ori, I love that game.
Ori.
It's so good. It's so good. The sound design, the music track, all of it. Again, there are some realistic elements in there, sure, but majority of it, is just their own design, and it makes sense with the visual. So when you're working to a visual, you want it to make sense, right? What you're seeing and what you're hearing should kind of line up, at least in a way that makes sense to you. So you want to make sure that whatever genre it is, it's that right flavor and the right sound that goes with it. You wouldn't do Mario with like really real sounds like his pants swishing and things like that when he's walking. I mean, it might sound a little bit too much there. And the big thing, I think, for the big note for devs, just experiment. I think a lot of people put too much weight on themselves, like, I have to get this right. And it's like, just try it. See.
Just have fun.
Have fun, see how it sounds, and then step back objectively and play it and say, does this, like, what is my response to this? Am I feeling? That's how I look at all my mixes that I do. If I'm not getting that emotional response that I would like others to be able to feel, then they're not going to feel it either. And if I am, then they will too. And that's kind of how I look at it. And there's, be aware of sounds that could take somebody out of an immersion. I remember, I think it was Saints Row 2. This was years ago. Gosh.
I played that game, yeah.
I love their games. And I remember driving their car, and I was going at like top speed, but the engine rev kept going.
Oh, I remember that.
And I was like,
I remember that. I remember noticing that too. Yeah.
And it really brought me out of the immersion, because I was like, wait a minute, why is the engine revving infinitely? That doesn't make sense.
Weirdly, I remember noticing that too. Yeah, I didn't think it would come back to me after all these years.
Isn't that crazy? Like, and I remember making a comment on it. This is over like 10, 15 years ago or so. A comment on it, like on a forum or something like that about it. And somebody else said, yeah, you're right. And I still sticks with me to this day. So it's like, when you look at things, it doesn't hurt to research, kind of like, let's say you're not sure about how a certain thing should sound, but maybe getting kind of close to it, especially something that's realistic or that you can see, making sure, especially if it's a car or something like that, making sure that you at least accurately pull off what it does, especially if it's like a real engine. If it's something that's futuristic, then the sky's the limit there, right?
Are you basically telling my audience to touch grass, Tony? Because
I it's funny that I mean, I don't know if I should tell them that, because I don't know if I do myself. So no, I'm kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, I don't even know if I do that. But it's just I think that sounds sometimes, and it's interesting that this stuck out to you too, that sometimes a sound may bring you out of it. And you don't want that somebody's listening to or playing a game, get all of a sudden they're like, what? That doesn't make sense, or that doesn't really work with this, because then that kind of throws it off. And honestly, people aren't going to know why they don't like it. They may not know exactly what it is, but a lot of the time, because when they don't know what it is and it's not a visual thing, it's probably sound.
Yeah, but to be honest, that applies to every single thing in a game in general. As you say, they may not know what they don't like. Usually it's sound. But yeah, to make it even more general, it could be something else entirely. It could be the story, it could be the gameplay.
Yeah.
But sound will probably be a big part of it, because it brings everything together so nicely. So yeah, it's I guess one top tip you can get from this talk is playtest, folks, because you never know. You never know that if your perception is exactly what an end player is going to feel.
And even have others like try it and see how they feel about it. Like, what's the experience like? I made this thing that I was working on. It was a binaural sound design, like audio drama type thing. It was just all audio only, and you had imagined like you're visually seeing it in your head. And I remember people going like, this is so detailed. They thought the phone was ringing in real life, and it's like they were so suspended by the sound. And I was an experiment to kind of see, like, will they put together images themselves? Will they feel that immersion and feel that same response I felt when I was building it? And they did, and so you'd be surprised on how much something that you feel is good, others will feel too. Really, they really will. And it's satisfying. And when you're looking at even like things like simple UI design is very important too. You're like, oh, it's just like the menu and stuff. But yeah, but it should feel satisfying. When you unlock a chest, does it sound like, you open a chest, congrats, there's some stuff in there, I guess. And like, okay, cool.
Well, look at Zelda and how they do it. I mean, make a bit.
Yeah, I love it. They make a whole deal about it. And it's beautiful because it makes you feel like an accomplishment. You're like, oh, cool, that's satisfying. Because if it wasn't, imagine opening like a chest or going to a menu and it's like all of a sudden it's like, it just feels flat, like, okay, where's the next thing? Where's the next response? Because you're looking for that experience. You're looking for that stimulation of what it is that's happening. You want some kind of stimulation to happen when you do something that feels satisfying in the game. And, that's awesome to think about. And there should be harmony, obviously, between the the UI and the music. So you don't want them to be like so different that like it's jarring, So it's just about really making them feel like it just fits fits the genre that you're going into, but it feels good to be there, and you feel like it's satisfying, and you can't put it down because it's just so awesome.
It's great that you bring up chests too, because I remember one of my favorite chests ever, the most iconic to me, are the Kingdom Hearts chests, which Sora just taps with a key and they open with that little flash of light and the fairy or fable like sparkles and such, even just the sparkling sound, and then the item name pops up, and then maybe it's something that you were looking for, something that you actually don't know what it is, but that's part of the experience.
It's part
and
of the
again
experience.
we go back to the concept of detail, because you wouldn't think that a chest is necessarily that important when it comes to just spending a lot of sound design time on it, but actually it is because you're giving your player a reward by opening that chest. So the whole experience, just opening a chest, is an experience in itself, and I think that is an interesting thing that just came up now. But I think we've been touching upon a few of these as we were going on. But I'd like to hear from you some tips and tools that indie game devs can look into, or just pick up and go from now. So, for example, we can get started as a starter. What is only one top tip that you would give a solo developer who wants to get started doing sound design properly today?
Having a powerful DAW to be able to a powerful editor, DAW, which means digital audio workstation, having something to be able to experiment in and play and have full freedom to be able to do that. Something like Reaper is a really good one, and I recommend to a lot of people. Actually, when I did some game dev sound stuff, I used Reaper because it had some nice scripting. I was able to edit and bring stuff out in chunks for people, and it was awesome for exporting. But it also gives you the lay of the land to play. You can put your plugins on there, and you can just go to town and see if you get that sound right that you want to incorporate into your game. Another good one that's a free one, or you can obviously pay, is a database to keep your sounds. Soundly is amazing. I use Soundly religiously. It's worth the subscription. It's like $15 because you get access to theirs. You can use your cloud storage, but it organizes all your sounds so that if you're looking for a gunshot, you're not like looking through your hard drive for all your gunshot folder. You search gunshot, boom, it just comes up, and you see all your gunshot sounds. It's like all metadata, and you're like, whoa, that's so much quicker for workflow. Huge, and my workflow, it makes things so much faster. So I'd say like powerful programs don't have to be expensive. Reaper I think is like $65, $75. Soundly, the subscription, but again, Reaper you can actually use for free for indefinitely until you decide to buy it. So anybody who's on a really tight budget, something like Reaper as an audio editor would be really, really cool to kind of step into and just play. And another big thing for you guys to keep in mind with sound design is layering. Layering is so So important. And something like Reaper or any kind of DAW that's similar to that logic, whatever you like to use, um, think about like when you listen to a sound and you're thinking about like, but it's a chest, for instance. Maybe it's got a lot of top end sound, like a lot of high frequency energy, and that sounds cool. But maybe a little bit of that low end might help add a little bit more of that kick and depth to it, make you feel a little bit of that too. So think about what kind of sounds you're going to be layering into that to create that, and then try it. You know, that's the big thing, experimentation, right? So I like to look at audio like ingredients to cooking. I'm not a good cook, which is surprising. You think I would be, being able to mix things, but maybe it's more I just haven't tried. But audio is like ingredients, you know, and you want the best quality ingredients that you can get. So you don't want to settle for a gunshot that sounds like it wasn't recorded that well and it was kind of, the fidelity is kind of or overly compressed, things like that. Let it breathe a little bit. You want some dynamics in your sound. You want things to have a little bit of movement, right? Movement creates that life, if you will. I think
and it's
that's
fun
really
that you brought up culinary ingredients in cooking, because what that made me think about is Venba. I don't know if you've played it. It just came out.
That's cool.
It's a cooking game, but also tells a beautiful story. I think it's stunning, that game.
I need to look into that.
Also, it helps you understand a culture that might not necessarily be close to us in such a compelling way with so many different themes. But the great thing that I loved about the game, the sound is in terms of sound design, is the fact that being a cooking game, the sounds of the tools and utensils and all of that is so beautiful to listen to when you're just playing around with different things and the wrappers. Cool. And so they did a great work there. They definitely did a great job with sound design there, which makes me think another point that may be worth discussing is think about the genre or the kind of game that you're making, because a cooking sound will have different, cooking game will have completely different needs compared to a horror game or an FPS or such. In FPSs, as you mentioned, maybe you want to emphasize the sound of clicking and sounds and reload and footsteps and such, whereas in cooking games, you want to emphasize the sound of the utensils and the ingredients and just the cutting on the cutting board, just to give you that experience of actually cooking, as if you were actually there.
And it's almost like adding that little bit of hyper realism to it, and it feels like almost like you're there with it, you know. Like if you're cutting something or you hear the cooking pot making the noise that it's making, and you know you're cutting your stuff up and you hear the utensils making the noise, they feel like, you should feel like they're really close to your ears. Like, ooh, I'm right here with it. It's so intimate. It's a very intimate type of sound, I feel like, and something like that would make it that seems so good and so realistic. It's like you're physically there. I think that's really cool, and I need to try it actually, because I think that's really cool that something like that is in if the sound was something that you really noticed there and found compelling, that means they did a really good job of captivating in something even so simple, cooking. That was simple, but in a game anyway. The sound was charming. It felt good. It felt like it works. And when you're doing that in your games, you know, you want it to feel like it meshes well with what you're doing. You know, it should all feel like a cohesive picture. Like everything works together, and the sounds that you have are the sounds that make sense to that. If you're making a scene of a jungle, it's easy enough for people to go, all right, well, here's the jungle backtrack. We're good. Now, I mean, yeah, you can use that as a layer, but then add in some extra like sounds of monkeys and birds and stuff, and then put them all around you in different places at different times, and the sound of wind through the trees. All of a sudden, now that jungle that was just a backing track is now this fully three-dimensional like thing that's around you, and you're looking at the visuals like, whoa. You know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that makes me think about other games, even so, like Ancestors, where you just play as primates, and you go around the jungle and actually there you use your five senses to just navigate the jungle, and sound is one of those. So you have to pay absolutely a lot of attention to predators in the nearby, or just the sound of the wind, and just to try and understand if danger may be lurking around the corner. I think that is super. super important. So I think we're getting near the end. So this may be the time to open the floor to the audience for questions. I can see that Master Abood popped in for a brief second and then left, realizing maybe that he came in a bit too late. But Quipscore, if you have an extra something that you want to ask Tony as we get to the end, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll just read the question out loud for him. But yeah, so we mentioned sound libraries, we mentioned advice and tools, we mentioned all of those things. I want to hear from you, Tony. What is, out of all the projects that you've done recently, what has been your favorite and why? If you can disclose it, of course.
Yeah, I could talk about at least one of them that I got to do. Colony Siege was really cool. It was like a RTS type game, but I got to do some of the cinematic stuff in there, like the character's helmet, he was a space helmet, and you could hear the echo inside there, and it just sounds so cool. And I love doing that. And even just the sounds of lasers, and I love sci-fi soundscapes. They sound so cool to me. Big fun project to work on. A lot of cool details in there. If you guys liked RTS type games. Another one that I could think of that I've worked on that was really fun. Let's see. Could I talk about it? Undying Flower was one that I really enjoyed. That one I'm under NDA for some of it, so I can't talk about everything. But some of it I can. They did have an open beta type thing they were doing. So I got to work on the design for some of the creatures, which was super cool. And for those of you guys that are looking to do sound design for monsters and creatures and things like that, Krotos, Krotos, makes amazing stuff. There's a plugin called Dehumanizer. It's amazing. You can make monsters in seconds.
I always wonder how you would do that.
You're so good. You could obviously use pitch shifters and things like that manually and do it, but Dehumanizer just makes it so that you're doing less of layering 25,000 plugins and more just using their interface to kind of build something around that, and it's so good. Really good stuff by Kronos.
And also because, pitch shifters and such, I always feel like you can still feel the human voice underneath, and it just doesn't feel quite like layering a lot of plugins on top of it. So maybe a bespoke tool is actually a bit more indicator for something like that.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think one thing... Oh, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, you're good. I was going to say... if people are well, where do I find sounds? Where do I get good sound? Good sound libraries are out there. You don't have to pay $1 bajillion for these sound packs and libraries. Epidemic Sounds, Splice has a sound catalog in there. Another thing I found for sounds, even if you're looking for things that are even free, as long as they're high quality, you have to kind of play with it. Use the Unity engine. If you download the Unity engine, even if you don't work in Unity, you
especially after what happened recently.
Yeah, you can use their engine. You can get sound pack, and you can find the location. You could take those sound files and put it in your own library,
and then you use them somewhere else.
You could just use them somewhere else. They're just assets that they gave out, so you can use them. But you have Soundly that's going to have their library as well. Epidemic Artlist has got good musical stuff. What's another one? Soundstripe. That's another really good subscription service. But, there's Ghost Hack is another place that makes some really good sounds. So depending on what you're looking for, there's a lot out there that doesn't have to break the bank, because I know budget's a big deal for people. But there's a lot of good stuff. Over time, you're going to build that library up. So if you get something like Soundly, you have maybe a Google Drive or a hard drive or whatever you want to do, you connect it to your Soundly, you're building your library up. And then let's say there's a sound you can't find. If you can't find it, make it. Because you can do anything, especially with the tools that we have available to us now.
Yeah, today especially.
Yeah.
Perfect. So, well, I guess to wrap things up, just because, that is also one of the, I suppose it would be one of the last steps in the sound design process. One thing that we haven't talked about too much is the process of mixing and how important it is. So what comes to mind is, for example, a game like Doom Eternal, where the music plays so well with the sound design itself. I mean, music is part of sound design, I suppose. But of course, music production is something completely different compared to making sound effects and voice and all of those.
Yes.
So how important is mixing? What are your best tips on that?
Yeah, mixing is a big deal, because I mean, if you have somebody that put all this time and energy into this beautiful soundtrack, and then you have footsteps or whatever that are just obnoxiously loud, that are completely overpowering the mix of music, that's going to feel a little weird and wonky and probably jarring in a lot of ways. So making sure that the balance of music and the balance of the sound effects fit together. And for something like that, if you're not sure how to make them mesh together, EQ is your best friend. Finding ways to EQ or notch out parts where something will sit that the music and the sound effect are fighting over, making room for everybody. There's a sound that needs to be here and is a very important part, but this thing is taking up too much space. Let's EQ a little bit out of that so we can make some room for it to sit in here. And then it feels cohesive and not like it's fighting it, right? Because then you get all kinds of other problems if it's fighting it. So your mix balance is really important. When it comes to voices especially, you definitely want them to be loud enough, but you don't want I personally don't like it when they sit on top of everything else. I like it more when they sit with it. And again, EQ is your best friend for that too, where everything sits or wrapped, almost like it's wrapping around it rather than it's down here, I'm up here.
Perfect.
That's kind of like a visual of how I explain it in my head.
But it makes sense though, because you're basically creating space through the EQ to just fit more sounds and just make sure that everything works together in tandem. Which is very powerful. I can see that we have Evan in the audience now. Hello, Evan. Always lovely to see you. If you have any questions for Tony, please drop them in the chat, because we're now, I guess, near the end. And one thing that I love to ask to all my guests is, with your experience and such, working in sound design, if you had to write a letter to yourself 10 years ago, what would you say relating to sound design?
I probably would be like, let that passion, keep that passion alive. And definitely, because a big part of what I do and why anybody should do anything that they love to do is the passion of it. And I love sound. And if I 10 years ago, I'd say, hey, keep that up, keep that passion alive, and don't settle for just, good enough. It's good enough sound. It's gonna work. It'll be fine. No, look for it's stunning. You want it to be like you're listening to this and even if it takes a little bit longer, to really feel like, man, that put me in that scene. And another example I was gonna mention for Undying Flower that I'd done. There was we did some ghost, like ethereal ghost sounds. Reverse reverb is a really cool technique for creating like ethereal voices or ethereal sounds in general. Reverse reverb, if you're not sure what that is, reverse reverb is a really cool technique. It's used in music and it's used in sound effects and voiceover. You could probably look it up and find a technique on it if you're not sure how it works. But basically, you're taking a file, you're putting reverb on it, you're reversing it, then you print it, and then you reverse it back, and it creates this rise into it.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
it's so fun. And I think another thing I tell myself is never stop exploring. You have to remember. Like, I think some people, when they get into something like this, they're like, oh gosh, I don't know where to start. And it's like, just play. Yeah. Because it's a creative thing. It's an art. This is an art, and art's subjective, and there is no authority on art.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you say there. And Evan actually is a horror game developer. She has this very special talent. She can turn any kind of game into horror, even inadvertently. So that is pretty cool. Don't know. Sorry, I had to say it.
That's so cool.
I guess I did ask this question for my marketing panel last week, or a couple weeks ago anyway. I know we're biased here, but I like to ask it. Do people really need to hire a sound design studio, or can they somehow create great sound by themselves?
That's a really good question. It's kind of like, it depends on your vision. If you know for sure what you want to hear and you know how to achieve it and you feel like you can get that yourself, yeah, absolutely. If you feel lost and you're not entirely sure where to go with it, or even sure if it'll land right, then definitely bring somebody else in. It's like me with something like animation. I have no idea where to start with that, how to do that, or why, or even how to accomplish it. I would probably have to bring somebody in to do it for me because I wouldn't know how. So a lot of the time it's I think just a starting point for people. I think sound. And another thing too that I would say that comes up in something like this, and why I would always say it's good to go with somebody, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't. And then once you release it, you're like, oh, I didn't know that, which is great for learning, I suppose. But when you have somebody in, you can learn that way too and be successful at the same time. So, it's the unknown unknowns that get you. And, I'm always looking to close gaps in those areas whenever I can too. So,
yeah, great points. But yeah, Tony, I guess, what can I say? It's been beautiful having you on the show and live for my Discord server and community. Yeah. You clearly love what you're doing, and that comes through. So where can other people find you? And if they do, what is a good way to support you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. I'm actually Immersed Prod on Twitter. So it's @ and then Immersed and then PROD. I'm also Tony Wijs VA on Twitter as well. Mm-hmm. And my website is immersedproductions.com. You can see some of the stuff we worked on, and we're always updating and adding more things to the list. So
yeah, well, I wish you all the best for your future projects. I'm sure you're up to something fun, and you're having a lot of fun doing it. Sound design is a great thing, as we've discussed, and it's great that you get to help so many people just create those immersive experiences that they wouldn't be able to maybe create themselves, as you say, depending on their vision and their expertise. So yeah, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me. This was really cool. I appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on yet another episode of the Indie Diaries podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and this one was especially a nice one. I loved chatting with Tony about anything sound design and creating stories through sound, and just harnessing the power of sound to make beautiful experiences. So thank you, Tony, for being a wonderful guest. I'm sure we will do something else together in the future. Best of luck until then. If you enjoyed the episode and you like the show in general, there are a lot of ways in which you can support me now. The easiest one is to subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to this. It could be Spotify, Apple Podcast, anywhere, or leave a 5-star rating depending on the platform. That helps so much, and it pleases the gods of the algorithm, as I always like to say. But you can also go to theindiediaries.com and find links to my cozy Discord server, which is a beautiful and growing community, my social media channels, patreon.com or Ko-fi if you want to support the show monetarily. That would be very much appreciated, and a lot of other ways in which you can help me out. Lastly, if you're an indie game developer, please get in touch, because my mainstream content is Indie Diaries, where I interview indie game developers from all types of backgrounds. The show is positive and inclusive, and I will never say no to anybody, but it may take waiting a little bit, because my schedule is super packed these days. But yeah, my listeners are always hungry for new stories from the indie game development community, so just get in touch, and I will be more than happy to have a chat with you.